In Dan in his Van episode 8, today I'm going to talk about musical intervals. I don't mean when you go back to the dressing room after the first set, have a fight and stick a television through the window. No, I mean more the distance between two notes, which can be expressed in a technical way. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, playing by ear, it's a good idea to have a good knowledge of intervals and to be able to hear those intervals. So there are tunes that you can memorize, for example, which give you particular distances, musical distances, and therefore you can work that out on your own instrument. So, for example, Auld Lang Syne, for example. Now, if I take the first note and the second note, that is a distance of a perfect fourth. That's what the interval's called. And a perfect fourth is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 semitones away from your fundamental. So we've got this note, which is G, G sharp A sharp B, and C. There we go. G to C is a perfect fourth. Now, if you're playing in a band and somebody's playing a G chord, and then it moves to a C, back to G, now this is an example with this 1920s mandolin of the chord changing, but the bass note didn't change. Now that's going to be an issue. When you listen to a chord, for example this, La, there's your bottom G, C, C. So we've got to get the distance between those two chords in terms of the bass notes. That's really important. When you're listening to a chord, if you get the first chord and then the second chord, you have to try and think in bass terms. Now, if you're doing a gig with a bass player who knows the tunes, it's easier. But if you are the bass player and you are listening to a guitar chord, it's not always apparent what that next chord is going to be. Now, I played Auld Lang Syne just now, which is your perfect fourth. For example, if you have a major sixths, which is My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. My Bonnie lies over the ocean. So that distance of a major sixth is My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. Now it's less common perhaps, but what about if that note went lower? Now, in terms of your rock and pop, you'd have G and then E minor. La, la. First two chords of your average 50s pop song goes G, E minor, G, E minor. Now those two chords sound very similar on this, and one of the reasons I've brought this into the van is that you can hear that it's not all about where that bass note goes. It's you have to listen out for the bass or try and reconstruct it. Now the ear is quite good at doing this because of upper harmonics. If you listen to a piece of music, if you wake up in the morning to an alarm clock with a speaker that's that big, of course it's not going to have any bass at all in it, but you will still be able to, your ear will still be able to construct that bass line from the upper harmonics that you're hearing. So actually it's not all that bad if you haven't got a bass line. You've just got to try and reconstruct it in your head. Now other intervals can be associated with other tunes, Banded those feet in ancient times, major third, dirty. So that's two tones. Or four semitones. Now, all of this is fine. until you start getting to more complex sounding intervals. So far we've dealt with the major scale. So if I play all the notes from with respect to G, that one, so you have a major second, a major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and then octave, which is archaically called a perfect octave, because those two notes are the same, or at least they're fairly similar on this. So the perfect fifth is the musical building block. If you know about perfect fifths, and you can go round and draw your circle of fifths, it gives you all your keys, all the chords that are in that key, all your sharps and flats, whatever. So perfect fifth is really important, and this is actually tuned in perfect fifths. It's exactly the same as a violin. So we've got G to D, and then D to A, and then A to E. So you have these fifths, and that's how you tune a mandolin or a violin. Guitars are tuned in perfect fourths. So if you've got the first string on the guitar, or the sixth string, the thickest one, which is an E, E, A, the next string is a fourth up, and then D, G, fourths. And then the next one is actually a major third between the G and the B, between the third and the second strings. G, B, and then the final one is B, E, and you come back to an E again. Now, thinking, well, why isn't the guitar just tuned in fourths all the way up? Well, you'd end up with a bit of a lopsided chord. You'd end up with one string that's E and one string that's F, which is the top one, because if you go from G, if you go a fourth up from that, you get a C. And then from the fourth up from C, you get an F at the top. E, A, G, E, A, D, G, C, F. It doesn't make any sense, whereas E, A, D, G, B, E makes much, much more sense. So you've got to be careful with intervals on guitar, because you've got that little half step closer interval between the third and the second strings. Now, major intervals is what I've just described, where I had major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, etc. The problem now comes with the minor scale. Now, those of you who are au fait with your modes, all of the minor intervals are contained within the Phrygian mode. So if I start from G, there's your Phrygian on G. So we have a minor second, minor third, your perfect fourth and perfect fifth are common to both types of scale. Then you have your minor sixth and the minor seventh. So if I play some of these intervals, like this one, that's actually a minor interval. But you could use it in an E flat major chord. So it doesn't really make much sense. Because you can have a C minor as well. You can have this. There you go, that's a minor chord now. Whereas this one is a major chord. So you get these problems where you got so that's a good minor sixth one. You can see all of them in the box below. I've just put a couple of tunes that may help you remember the intervals. So what happens in gigs then, if you've got a guitarist who's playing some chords, you've got to try and work out how far it is that they've gone. Now, intervals, so far I've talked about intervals going up, but actually they can go down as well. Now, one of the reasons you've got a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth is if I take the G here, from there to there, la da 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 dee, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, perfect fifth. But if I go down to the same note, so it's a D but an octave lower, that's gone down a fourth. So if you go from G to D, you're either going up 5 or down 4. And you always have that added up. So if I go from G to E, or G to E, I've gone up a sixth or down a third. So they'll always add up to 9. Just be mindful of that as well. If you're going up 5, just think, oh, well, it's either up 5 or down 4. And that's basically how it works. So if you're going up 6, you could go down 3. If you're going up 7, you could go down 2. And that's basically how that works. Now, when I say down 2 or up whatever, the first note is classed as number 1. So, for example, from the D, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have 1 in the middle, and then it goes up 5 or down 4, but you count the first one. Now that's different from steps and semitones, because this one, that's the first semitone, so you count that as 0. But that's the intervals, you have to count the first note as number 1. So hence the reason it adds up to more than an octave, because an octave, if you remember, is 8 notes in a complete octave scale, but we're adding up to 9. And the reason is because you count number 1 going in both directions. So one note sort of doubles, hence the extra 1. So there is a little bit about intervals. It's worth playing on the piano. Now, if you are playing the piano, test out your major intervals by going from C to C, which is all white notes, and that gives you all your major ones. And if you want to practice the minor ones, start on E on the piano, and the Phrygian on E contains all the white notes. So you can then start to practice your intervals. Now, there is one remaining interval that I haven't talked about yet. So far, we've had all the major ones and all the minor ones, which accounts for all but one of the intervals. And that one is called the tritone, or it's called the augmented fourth diminished fifth, sometimes referred to as the devil's interval. Now, when I say tritone, it's 3 tones. So it doesn't really make much sort of tuneful sense. But it represents exactly halfway between one particular note and the octave up. So we've got G, C sharp, and then G. Now, bass players, jazz musicians, will know all about these tritones because you can change the bass note from one particular note. Say if we've got G and G7, for example. Now, I could change that bass note from G to C sharp, but keeping the same chord. They're actually the same. Now that's because the third and the seventh are actually switched around. But we're kind of going into more sort of delving into music theory terms. But sometimes when a bass player plays a note that you're not expecting, just be mindful that it may be that they're just what's called substituting the bass note that they would have used, that another bass player may have used, and they're just playing the diminished fifth or the augmented fourth or a tritone away. Now, it just revolves around just practicing and some listening, and you can get all these sort of listening apps which allow you to sort of practice your intervals, and you can sort of tap the answer on your iPad and it says yes or no. And it's worth sitting at a piano, as I say, between C and C if you're working with major intervals and perfect ones, and E to E if you're using the minor, if you're practicing your minor intervals. Now, that's basically the perfect fourth and the perfect fifth will remain in both of your major and minor scales. So there it is. There's a little insight into some intervals and how to sort of start practicing them.